This is the latest project from Joe Penna, who made a movie called Arctic a few years back, starring Mads Mikkelsen, and I had a few issues with it, but overall thought it was pretty good. So when I saw this was coming out, a sci-fi space movie starring, among others, Anna Kendrick, I was intrigued. So I basically immediately checked it out, and well, my first impressions were very positive. Because the first thing that stood out were the visuals. Not only does this look very good, I liked the cinematography quite a bit, but I also liked the production design a lot. It just had this realistic and grounded approach to how everything looked. Instead of this over-stylized, hyper-futuristic look that a lot of space movies go with. The ship and everything else looked pretty much exactly what you might expect things to look like in the not too distant future. So all of that was great and immediately got me more excited for the movie. And the second thing I noticed was the sound design, because it's really great. Especially in that opening scene, it's just excellent, and I do suggest watching this with a decent sound system. And that alone makes me wish I saw this in the theater, because there's just so much detail in there. Small things that one might not even notice, but if you pay attention, it's really quite impressive. And on a similar note, I did like the score in this a fair bit too. It just worked very well and sometimes stood out as being pretty much perfect. So all in all, I don't really have any complaints about that side of things. However, when it comes to the actual story, I feel like the movie starts to stumble a little bit. But what is the movie even about? Well, it's about this small crew on their way to Mars, where there apparently is some sort of small colony. I don't know, the details were a bit vague. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because the entire movie takes place on this tiny little ship. And well, the title kinda gives away the big twist here. There's of course a stowaway on board, which naturally causes complications to arise, and the crew has to find ways to deal with it. And I feel like I already basically said too much, more or less summarized the entire plot, even though I really didn't say much at all, because well, it is actually a very simple and straightforward movie. Much like Arctic, which was also written by Joe Penna and Ryan Morrison. I guess they just don't like to overcomplicate things and instead prefer to keep it simple. Now this isn't quite as bare bones as Arctic on account of the scenario itself being a bit more complicated, and this also has a larger cast of characters as well, although 4 is still not a lot. But the similarities are there between the two movies, and I don't actually mind a story like this at all. But there's just not that much to it, and the runtime did start to feel like it was beginning to stretch it. Not too much, it wasn't a real issue, the pacing was still decent. And here's the thing, I feel like pretty much everything was fine until that last, 10-15 minutes, something like that. Where they just throw in, it's not really a twist, it's just another obstacle, yet another complication. And there's actually a great Finnish phrase for what they did there. Tekemällä tehty. Which just means it felt forced, they tried too hard, it felt like they overdid it. They did it for the sake of doing it. And that kinda took me out of it and made me shake my head a little bit. Because as I alluded to earlier, this is one of these realistic-ish sci-fi movies that, despite the things going on, tries to keep it somewhat grounded and realistic. And then it just throws something like that in there that's just so improbable that it kinda ruins the whole illusion. And don't get me even started on the very last few minutes, because it seemed like pure fantasy. Now I'm primarily talking about the visual representation of the last events, not even the events themselves. And I'm not a scientist and I couldn't find any concrete info on this when I looked it up. But I don't think that's quite how it would play out in real life. But I might be wrong. However, I'm just saying it felt very out of place in a movie that tries this hard to be somewhat realistic. Now what should I call it? Emotional climax of the movie did make sense. In fact, if you just look at the characters, who they are and what they're like, there really wasn't any other way this could go, and I saw it coming a mile away. Even long before the events that kind of necessitated the character to make the choices they made, Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a lot better than characters making decisions that don't make sense, right? But it just wasn't very surprising, and it kinda solidified this as a bit of a mediocre story. And despite me not having any real issues until the last part, I am struggling to justify giving it much more than a high 6. Boop. But I would still probably recommend it to fans of sci-fi because it was still pretty solid. So maybe check it out, or maybe don't. After all, I'm not your dad. But hey, what are your thoughts on this? Have you seen it? Did you like it? Let me know. And if you enjoyed the video, maybe give it a thumbs up or sub to the channel because that would be fantastic.